Hello and welcome to another video on SPC 229 schema. This is your Vice Chair, Jason Glazer. Today we are covering just two data groups, Service Water Heating Distribution System and ServiceWaterPiping. After the video is posted, it'd be great if you could discuss any issues you find by email. Hopefully those will all be identified during the first week, and after that we'll have a letter ballot also lasting about a week. If minor changes are required, they'll be just included with the letter ballot. If it's something more complicated, as I've said before, it'll be referred back to the schema working group and brought up again in a future ballot. Today's video is the first of 3 videos covering service water heating equipment. I thought I would provide a high-level view of how everything is connected first. The first video is covering how the main pieces are connected up. The service water distribution system and piping are similar to how fluid loops work, and expect that other data groups will describe components in the service water heating equipment and reference the distribution system. The second video will be covering most of the common equipment and associated validation points. So that'll be on service water heating equipment and those validation points. The third video is going to cover other equipment and specifically how service water heating usage is described. Remember, the schema is intended to aid in validating that the transformation between the user's model and the baseline model is done correctly, and not intended to be a universal model of everything that can appear in a building or modeled by a simulation program. One thing many of you will notice that have primarily a 90.1 background is that this part of the schema seems to have a lot more details than necessary. That is because part of the schema was heavily influenced by the needs of Title 24, which has more in-depth description of service water heating for both residential and non-residential buildings. For an Appendix G submittal, only a small subset of the data elements are likely to be required. So let me start with the top. Whoop. Sorry about that. So the root element, ASHRAE 229, is connected to the rule set model instance. And that's connected directly to the service water heating equipment data group. And it's harder to see, but also to the service water heating distribution system data group. Now, the service water heating equipment data group references these validation points, and we'll get to those later. And the service water distribution system data group references service water piping, which interestingly enough can also reference itself, service water piping. Zone is references the distribution system also, and the data group that references how the amount of usage of service water heating is referenced by the space data group, and it also referenced the service water heating distribution system. And finally, the solar thermal is part of, or is a child of service water heating equipment when you're involving solar system, a solar hot water system. So there's a lot of pieces to this. Oh, I forgot tank. And then obviously there are tanks for service water heating equipment systems that the distribution system references. So there's a lot of pieces altogether in this, and I will try to work our way through it one part at a time, and you'll see how they all fit together. So we're going to start with the distribution system and the piping today. So service water heating distribution system, as I said, is similar to how fluid loops work. That's not the right thing. So there's an ID, a reporting name, and notes. And then after that, there's a couple numeric inputs for the design supply temperature and the design supply temperature difference. So that would be for the surface water heating loop. Then there's a reference to the tanks that are in the loop, whether or not it's a central system, and that's a Boolean. So this would be as opposed to a distributed system where there might be like under sink heating systems for water. And then there's a reference to the ServiceWaterPiping, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. There's a parameter called distribution compactness, which is specific to Title 24. There's another enumeration on control type and on configuration type. We'll get to those in a minute. And then there's a couple of things about drain heat recovery. One is whether it's used by the water heater, if there's what the efficiency of the shower drain heat recovery is, and the type of shower drain efficiency or shower drain recovery type, which is another enumeration. And finally, there's a schedule for the flow multiplier and two things related to the entering temperature. One is a schedule for the entering water mains temperature, and one is an indicator of whether the ground temperature can be used for the entering temperature instead. So you would not use both of those. Now one of those, let me go through the enumerations. A couple of those are actually Title 24 specific enumerations. One is this compactness. So the options are not compact, basic, compact, and expanded credit. Those are directly out of Title 24. And then the control options from Title 24 are demand controlled, no control, no loop or central system pump, temperature modulation, and temperature modulation and monitoring. And of course, other is often in most of these schema enumerations. And then there are a few enumerations that are general enumerations. So surface water heating configuration options, and these reference a lot of things having to do with HERS. So there's parallel piping that's HERS, HERS pipe insulation all lines, HERS recirculation demand controlled occupancy sensor, and these are all things coming out of the HERS standard. And then there's just simply parallel piping, insulated and protected pipe below grade, pipe insulation on all lines, point of use, recirculation, demand controlled occupancy sensor, and demand controlled button. So that would be when you have a button that controls the flow, and then non-demand controlled and standard and other. So a lot of different ways to control this. So the second data group we want to cover today is service water heating piping. So if you remember, the distribution system references the piping system, and then the piping system can actually reference other piping. So again, it has an ID reporting name and notes, an indicator of whether it's part of a recirculation loop. So that's a yes or no for that. The insulation thickness, which is a numeric value. The location of the loop pipe. And then if certain zones, I'll talk about the different types of locations in a minute, but one of the options is for it to be a zone. And if it is a zone, then a reference to that zone. And then the length and diameter of the pipe. And then again, the child surface water heating piping. So this is referencing back to another one of these surface water piping data groups. So they can be nested, and a very complicated system could be described where the lengths and diameters of basically each pipe can be described as part of this, and each one can be located in different zones. So it's a very accurate but complicated way of describing the piping system. So one of the things there was the component location options. Let me go through that. So those can be in a zone, as we talked about. And then there are other options in which they're described as being in certain places that aren't specific zones. So this would be setting the conditions of the heat transfer through the pipe. So conditioned, semi-conditioned, outside, garage, attic, crawl space, underground, or unconditioned or other. So those are all different options, and they would have different sets of temperature conditions on the other side. So that's all for today. Thanks for watching the video. As a reminder, if you have questions or comments about the schema, please just reply to everyone with your comment, and hopefully it can be resolved as part of the ballot. About a week after this video is released, you should be receiving a letter ballot from ASHRAE to vote on this, and that'll be actually a week from Wednesday. So I look forward to any discussions you might have on this, and thank you very much.